Good day. A couple of days ago, I did a video for this channel in which I discussed President Zelensky's visit to Ankara and his meeting there with President Erdogan of Turkey and the various comments that both Zelensky and Erdogan made over the course of that meeting and the joint statement that both of them signed and which was published. I pointed out that this joint statement and all these various comments in which President Erdogan appeared to side with Ukraine on all the substantive issues of the conflict with Russia and with eastern Ukraine was clearly intended to raise Russian hackles and could be seen as a form of trolling. Specifically, President Erdogan said that he supported Ukraine's bid for NATO membership. He said that Crimea was occupied territory, occupied by Russia implicitly, and should be returned to Ukraine. He said that Donbass is occupied territory, again implicitly saying that it is occupied by Russia. He spoke about military cooperation between Turkey and Ukraine, and he spoke about the need for Ukraine and Turkey to develop together naval ships and other forms of military equipment. It was, to all appearances, a resounding statement of support from Erdogan for the Ukrainian government and for President Zelensky in the course of their current standoff with Russia. In fact, and this is a point, by the way, that has been picked up in the Russian media, when unpacked and examined closely, President Erdogan's comments were somewhat more nuanced than this might suggest. He emphasized, for example, that there could only be a peaceful resolution of the crisis, appearing to rule out a Ukrainian offensive in eastern Ukraine. He spoke about the need for negotiations to resolve the crisis, and he also insisted upon, and it appears in the joint statement, that those negotiations be carried out within the framework of the Minsk agreement, which requires the Ukrainian government to negotiate directly with the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, the two breakaway republics in the Donbass, which President Erdogan, of course, said in this statement are occupied presumably by Russia. So in the matters of symbolic importance, where Turkey has no practical influence, the status of Crimea, the status of Donbass, the question of Ukraine's future NATO membership, Erdogan spoke loudly and forcefully in support of Ukraine and Zelensky, but on the matters of immediate substance, the matters of practical importance, he appeared to accept the Russian red lines. So he ruled out a Ukrainian military assault on the two breakaway republics in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, and he also spoke about the need for Ukraine to abide by the Minsk agreements and to negotiate by implication with the leaders of the two breakaway republics, the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. This is something, incidentally, which Ukraine has consistently refused to do, and which Ukraine is constantly looking for some way out of. Well, the danger with trolling someone more powerful than yourself is that, of course, it might provoke a stronger reaction than you bargained for. And in this case, Erdogan, by trolling the Russians on these issues of Ukraine's NATO membership, on the status of Crimea and of the Donbass, was provoking a Russian reaction which may in fact have been stronger than he might have anticipated. I say that because the Russians are clearly furious by Erdogan's comments over the course of this visit. And this was made crystal clear by certain statements that were made over the course of a visit to Cairo by Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov. After meeting with Egypt's foreign minister at a press conference, Lavrov made the following comments. The question that was put to him during the press conference was the following. The media and various experts linked President Zelensky's recent trip to Turkey to Ankara selling attack drones to Kiev. Is Russia concerned about the possibility of such deals? Well, that question then led to a very strong and detailed answer from Lavrov, which gives every sign of having been pre-prepared. And this is what he said. We strongly advise all responsible countries with which we are in contact, Turkey is one of them, to analyze the situation and Kiev's continuing warlike statements. We warn them against feeding this militaristic sentiment. It is no secret that already in 2014, the new Kiev government, the Pushchists, emboldened by the encouragement it received following the anti-constitutional coup, carried out an act of aggression against its own people. When officials from the Zelensky administration say that Kiev is not planning anything in Donbass because it cannot fight its own people, they are not telling the truth. After the Revolution of Dignity, which in fact was an unconstitutional coup, Kiev attacked its people and has since waged a war against them, having declared its own citizens terrorists, even though Donbass residents didn't attack anyone in the rest of Ukraine, but simply asked Kiev to leave them be and let them figure out what was going on after the neo-Nazis grabbed power in Kiev and immediately came out against the rights of Russian-speaking people living in that country. I hope that everyone, including the countries that are discussing the possibility of supplying military equipment to Ukraine, remember this history. Well, this is an extraordinarily strong statement, and note some of its details. Firstly, Lavrov is very careful never to call the authorities in Kiev the Ukrainian government. He calls them the Kiev government or the Zelensky administration, but he never says Ukrainian government, and he never says Ukraine as the country which these people are leading. These words, of course, imply that the Ukrainian government is less than fully legitimate. And in fact, we can see that because in other parts of this statement, he refers to the people who gained power in 2014 as a result of what Ukrainians call the Revolution of Dignity as the Pushchists, and he refers to the so-called Revolution of Dignity, the Maidan events of 2014, as an unconstitutional coup. He even goes so far as to speak of the people who took power in Kiev as a result of the Maidan events as neo-Nazis who grabbed power in Kiev and immediately came out against the rights of Russian-speaking people living in that country. So what he is basically saying is that as a result of the comments that he made, Erdogan is siding with neo-Nazis, Pushchists, people who gained power through an unconstitutional coup, who do not tell the truth when they say that they have no plans to launch attacks on their own people, and who are warlike and aggressive, and who wish to trample on the rights of Russian-speaking people living in their own country. So he is effectively telling Erdogan, you are not just wrong, you are appallingly, horribly, shockingly, disgracefully wrong. Now, that's what he said about the situation in Ukraine. But of course, Lavrov said a great deal more. And it wasn't just about Ukraine. Over the course of this press conference, he discussed in great detail the situation in Libya and the situation in Syria. And sometimes it's useful when considering what a diplomat of the level of Lavrov has to say, to consider what he doesn't say as well as what he actually does say. Because, of course, Turkey is heavily implicated or involved in both the wars in Libya and in Syria. There are actually Turkish troops stationed in Syria, and Turkey is involved both in supporting jihadi fighters in Syria and is a party to the so-called Astana process, which is a mediation process brokered by Russia and Turkey, which supposedly is seeking a peaceful resolution of the crisis in Syria. And of course, Turkey over the course of the last year has become actively involved in Libya also and has supported the Libyan government in Tripoli, which is incidentally opposed by Egypt, the country which, of course, Lavrov was visiting. Now, what is remarkable is that over the course of these very detailed comments that Lavrov made in Cairo about the situation in Syria and in Libya, he never referred to Turkey or to Erdogan once. He never spoke, for example, about Turkey's helpful role in brokering the Astana process. He does actually mention the Astana process, but he says absolutely nothing about Turkey's role in it. He also talks about how the situation in Libya has stabilized and how there are now negotiations between the government in Tripoli, which Erdogan backs, and the government in Tobruk, which Erdogan opposes, for a peaceful reunification of Libya. But again, he says nothing about Turkey over the course of any of these comments. It's as if Turkey and its role in Syria and Libya did not exist. And frankly, that is extraordinary. That is really remarkable. And it suggests that the Russians are now so angry about Erdogan's comments and statements that he made over the course of Zelensky's visit to Ankara, that they're signaling to Erdogan that if he persists in this type of behavior, then he can expect that the Russians will continue their attempts to pacify Syria and Libya without further involving him. In other words, he will be marginalized, and Turkey will be marginalized, and Russia will seek solutions by itself with whatever other partners it has. And in fact, if you track carefully Lavrov's comments, it becomes fairly clear what partners he has in mind. Egypt, as well as Turkey, is heavily involved in Libya. And one of the things that came across during the course of Lavrov's visit to Cairo is how friendly relations between Egypt and Russia have become. And one almost gained the impression from some of the comments that Lavrov made over the course of this press conference that in settling the situation in Libya, Russia sees Egypt as a more helpful and useful partner than it sees Turkey. Now, in relation to Syria, Egypt is also a quiet de facto supporter of the Syrian government of President Assad, which Russia, of course, backs. But here, perhaps, Lavrov's comments were even more interesting, because in discussing the Syrian situation, Lavrov made it fairly clear that the primary focus of Russian diplomacy at the moment is to get Syria back into the Arab League. The Arab League is actually based in Cairo, and Lavrov, whilst in Cairo, actually had discussions at the Secretariat of the Arab League. The Arab League is, of course, the association of all Arab states. It expelled Syria over the course of the crisis in Syria in 2012 or 2013, and it at a time when Syria was at loggerheads with the powerful Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Now, Lavrov says that Lavrov has recently visited Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and he says that over the course of his discussions there, he broached with the leaders of those countries the possibility of Syria being readmitted into the Arab League. And he suggested that, in fact, the Gulf Arab states are becoming increasingly positive about this prospect. They recognize that President Assad's government is not going to fall. They're anxious to re-establish relations with President Assad, if only so as to counter Iranian influence in Syria. This has been much discussed in the Middle Eastern media, and it's been clear for some time that the Arab states, the Gulf Arab states, are gradually edging towards some sort of rapprochement with President Assad, which would, of course, include readmission into the Arab League. Now, if that happens, if Syria is indeed readmitted into the Arab League, then Turkey's position in Syria begins to look extremely difficult, because at that point, President Assad can persuasively say that Turkey, by positioning its troops in Syria, is not merely occupying Syrian land, it is also occupying Arab land, and he can probably get, via the Arab League, Arab support, including the support of the Gulf states, to have those Turkish troops withdrawn. In addition, the strong Arab countries of the Gulf, the strongly Islamist Arab countries of the Gulf, specifically Qatar and Saudi Arabia, are the countries which ideologically are closest in attitudes to the various jihadi groups that are in northern Syria and which survive under Turkish protection. Saudi Arabia, of course, has particular reasons to feel angry with Turkey and with Erdogan because of Erdogan's role in the Khashoggi affair, in which he basically identified the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, as the murderer of Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist who was killed in Turkey. And at the same time, Erdogan and Turkey have cultivated a very close relationship with Qatar, which was previously at loggerheads with Saudi Arabia, but which has subsequently become friends with Saudi Arabia again. So it's conceivable that the Saudis and the Qataris, both, as I said, the two strongest Islamist, the most hardline Islamist states in the Gulf, might say that the presence of these jihadi groups in Syria is no longer acceptable, that they're no longer true jihadi fighters, as Erdogan claims, that they are in fact terrorists and that they should be expelled from Syria and that Turkey should remove itself from Arab land. Now, if that happens, then Erdogan is, politically speaking, in great difficulty. It is difficult to see how, if he is isolated in that kind of way, in terms of his Syrian adventure, he can keep his troops in Syria or continue to play a role there. So what Lavrov is in effect, or so it seems to me, saying is that if Erdogan continues to play great games in Ukraine, he will be marginalized both in the Libyan and Syrian conflicts, and that will not go well for him. Now, how Erdogan is going to read all of this, I have absolutely no idea. It's difficult to imagine that he's going to back off. He's made very public statements now in support of Ukraine. So I think on balance, he's going to have to continue along the lines that he has done. But it's perhaps worth pointing out that President Erdogan has found himself in a quarrel with the Russians, a very public quarrel with the Russians over Ukraine, at the same time that he is in a very public quarrel with the Europeans over that bizarre and ludicrous episode of the seating arrangements afforded to Charles Michel and Ursula von der Leyen when they visited him in Turkey a few days ago. And of course, Erdogan has a tetchy relationship, to put it mildly, with the United States also. He's now antagonized the Saudis over the Khashoggi affair, and he's infuriated the Egyptians because of his meddling in Libya, which is in Egypt's backyard. He is running out of friends. In fact, at the moment, it's difficult to see that he has any friends. His economy is in deep trouble, and he's looking increasingly unpopular in parts of his own country. Logically and sensibly, he needs to stop. Turkey has no great interests in Ukraine. Any fantasies about regaining control of Crimea can be quickly forgotten. And for Erdogan to troll Putin and the Russians in this way is beyond irresponsible and completely reckless. Well, that's what I'm going to say about this whole rather bizarre episode of Erdogan and Zelensky. I do want to touch quickly and briefly upon another issue, which is that certain statements that were made by Zelensky's spokesman, Yulia Mendel, to the effect that Zelensky has been frantically telephoning or trying to speak to Putin to try to sort out some kind of stand down in relation to the conflict in Ukraine. Dmitry Peskov, who is Putin's spokesman, says that the Russians have no idea what Mendel is talking about, and in subsequent comments she seemed to draw back and say that in fact her comments had been made to Reuters, by the way, had been misinterpreted, and that Zelensky had not in fact been trying to call Putin at all, but that this was all related to the events that took place back in March at a time when 4 Ukrainian soldiers were killed on the contact line, and Ukraine was trying to speak to various parties in order to try to de-escalate the situation there. Well, it's difficult to know exactly what's going on here. I personally would not be surprised if Zelensky had indeed attempted to speak directly to Putin. But what I will say about that is this. Putin has become extremely reluctant for a long time now to talk to Ukrainian leaders on a one-to-one basis. He did speak to President Poroshenko of Ukraine several times over the course of 2014, shortly after President Poroshenko became president in the aftermath of the Maidan events. This was deeply controversial in Russia. It was seen as de facto recognition of Poroshenko's position as president of Ukraine. And in addition, it was seen as, in some ways, by some people, as a betrayal of the people of the Donbass. I think, however, what caused Putin to stop having these calls with Poroshenko or with other Ukrainian leaders on a one-to-one basis is not so much the question of legitimacy. Rather, it was his concerns that things that he said to the Ukrainians were being misreported by them to third parties. Since then, since 2014, Putin has consistently preferred to speak to Ukrainian leaders like Poroshenko and Zelensky with the Germans and the French, Merkel and Hollande at one time, Merkel and Macron now, with the European leaders present. And the reason is in part, obviously, is that he wants the Europeans to assist him to try to moderate the Ukrainians and to get the Ukrainians to see, as Putin would say, sense, and to fulfill the commitments they made under the Minsk Accords. But I also think that it's partly because he wants the Germans and the French there as witnesses to what he actually said and to what was actually said over the course of the discussions with the Ukrainians, so that the Ukrainians cannot go away and misreport it. So I think it is frankly unlikely that Putin will speak to Zelensky on a one-to-one basis in the way that Zelensky appears to want. I suspect that Zelensky may be angling for that, partly because he hopes by speaking to Putin to bolster his claim that he's in a position to discuss things directly with Putin and that this is an international conflict between Ukraine and Russia. This is something that the Russians do not want to accept, and they don't trust Zelensky to accept that and to report it properly if they point it out to him in a one-to-one conversation. So I personally think it is unlikely that Putin will want to speak to Zelensky on a one-to-one basis at this time. On the contrary, all the efforts the Russians are making at the moment are focused upon the summit meeting of Putin, Zelensky, Macron and Merkel, which is apparently being prepared and which I discussed in my previous video. I expect that this will take place fairly soon, almost certainly through video conference, and that will be the moment when this present flare-up in eastern Ukraine finally ends and the drawdown of forces is agreed. Thank you very much for joining me for this program. Please remember to check me out on our other main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Please also check out Alex's channel. You'll find links under this video. Please check us out on our other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, and especially Odyssey. Please also support us to the extent that you can through PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. And remember, we accept donations in all currencies, including the new currencies such as Bitcoin. Also check out our Discord server. And last but not least, please go to our shop, buy yourself the wonderful things you will find there, our famous magic mugs, our wonderful t-shirts, our sweatshirts, our hats, our hoodies, and all the rest. And thank you very much for joining me in this long and intricate program, in this series of programs I have been doing about the present flare-up in Ukraine. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day.